I've always liked winter mornings. Something about the way the cold air bites at your skin feels refreshing. It clears your head like nothing else. I usually jogged early, before the sun rose, when the streets were empty and the world felt like mine alone. That morning wasn't any different. At least, that's what I thought when I laced up my sneakers and stepped out the door. The air was biting cold with a thick, clinging fog in the otherwise dimly lit street. The street lights flickered every now and then, casting faint pools of light that barely cut through the haze. But I didn't mind. The silence was peaceful, the world was still asleep, and I liked it that way. I started my run, feeling the rhythmic thud of my feet against the pavement. My breath came out in little clouds, puffing in front of me like smoke signals. Everything felt so serene. Empty streets, quiet houses, just me, the cold, and the fog. After about 10 minutes, I reached the park. It's usually busy during the day, but now it was deserted, not a soul in sight. I'd figured I'd do 3 laps around it and head home before the chill really set in. The first lap was fine, but halfway through the second, I started to feel off. It wasn't immediate, just a creeping sense of unease. Like the air had grown heavier, the silence became more oppressive. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. But every time I looked back, all I saw was the fog, thick and impenetrable. By the time I started the third lap, the feeling had only gotten worse. My skin prickled, my heartbeat quickened, and I kept thinking I heard faint footsteps behind me. I'd stop and turn, scanning the park, but there was no one, just the low groan of trees swaying in the cold wind.
Stop hallucinating, Lizzie,
I told myself. Maybe the fog was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to take a break. I plopped myself on one of the benches by the playground to catch my breath. As soon as I sat down, I heard it, rustling, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My pulse spiked, and I shot up, eyes darting around.
Is anyone there?
I called out, my voice sounding small and shaky. No answer. I scanned the area, trying to focus, but the fog was too thick. It was like trying to see through a wall of smoke. And then I heard it, a soft chuckle. The sound cut through the silence, so sharp it made my skin crawl.
Who's there?
My voice was more desperate now, but still no reply. Only the eerie faint laughter, closer this time. And then she stepped out from the fog. A woman, tall and gaunt, her red hair matted and hanging in limp strands around her face. She was wearing a torn white nightgown, stained with crimson, awfully resembling blood. My eyes slowly traced upwards until I met her bloodshot one. Her eyes. God, her eyes. They were wide, wild, smeared with mascara like she'd been crying for hours. I froze, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. The woman's lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing kind about it. It was the kind of smile that sent chills down your spine, the kind of smile that made you want to run. And then I saw her hand. She was clutching something. A finger. A man's severed finger. There was blood dripping from it, staining the snow at her feet, and dangling from the finger was a wedding ring. My stomach turned. I felt bile rise in my throat. I took a step back and stumbled to the ground. A woman let out a hollow laugh.
Now he's single,
She said, shoving the finger in the air. Her tone was mocking, almost gleeful.
He doesn't have to hide his affair from me anymore.
Before I could even process what she had said, her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed on the ground right beside me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. My mind was blank, overwhelmed by a flood of horror. And then somehow, I snapped out of it. My hands fumbled for my phone as I shakily dialed 911. The cops arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. They took the woman away, but not before telling me the truth. Sophia was an artist who had killed her husband while he slept. She was somehow convinced he was having an affair with his secretary. Afterward, she cut off his ring finger and wandered the streets in a daze. I was later told that Sophia was sent to a mental institution. She never spoke a word again after that night. And me? I haven't jogged in the early morning since. Not ever. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. Steven and I needed a break from everything. Work, family, the city. So we rented an Airbnb in the woods, a cozy cabin deep in the middle of nowhere. It was winter, and the world around us was draped in snow, making it feel like we were completely isolated from everything else. Exactly what we wanted. We arrived at around sunset. The cabin was adorable, with a creaky wooden deck, and inside, a stone fireplace already laid out with logs. By the time we unpacked and settled in, it was dark outside. We opened a bottle of red wine. After a few glasses, Steven suggested we explore the property. There was supposed to be a small clearing behind the cabin, so we bundled up and trudged out into the cold. We were tipsy, walking haphazardly and giggling. We soon stumbled upon a small mound, partially hidden in snow, near the edge of the woods. Strange, there was a stone marker, like a headstone of a grave, but there was no name, just a weird symbol. It looked like two interlocking circles, with a serpent twisting between them. Steven knelt down to brush off the snow, laughing. He was always the braver one between us, always curious.
It's a grave, right? Maybe it's someone's pet.
I don't know. No name. Could be anything. He was drunk, and in his ridiculous state, he unzipped his pants and started peeing on it, laughing all the while. I swatted at him, telling him he was being disrespectful, but he just waved me off, laughing as he finished. I felt uneasy. Something about that grave unsettled me, but I was too tipsy to really process it. So we headed back to the cabin, stumbling and laughing. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was like scratching, the kind of sharp, repetitive noise that made my skin crawl. I reached over, but Steven wasn't in bed. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up. The scratching, it was coming from outside. I pulled on my coat, my hands trembling as I opened the door. I saw Steven standing in the snow, staring out into the woods, motionless. His breath was visible in the air, and I could hear that scratching sound, louder, like nails on stone.
Stefan, what are you doing?
He didn't answer. The scratching grew louder, a horrible grating noise that made me feel like I was losing my mind. It wants to come out. His voice was flat, almost distant, like he was in some kind of trance. I grabbed his arm, trying to shake him out of it.
Come back right now. Something isn't right.
The grave. It wants to come out. He pulled away from me and ran towards the grave. I followed him, the snow stinging my face as I stumbled after him. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the snow, his hands bare as he dug into the frozen ground.
Stop it! Stefan, stop!
I tried to pull him away, but he was strong, stronger than I'd ever seen him. His nails were breaking, his fingers red and raw as he tore at the snow like he was possessed. And then I saw it, a fox emerging from the woods. Its eyes glowed in the dark, an unnatural eerie light that made my stomach twist. It watched us, its gaze fixed on Steven, but when it came out, I was shocked. It wasn't red, but black. Finally, Steven stopped. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and unfocused. I pulled him to his feet and we started back towards the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. As we reached the deck, a deep growl echoed from the direction of the grave, low and guttural. I turned, and there was the fox, sitting atop the mound, its eyes still glowing, its body curled up like it was guarding something, looking at us. Steven collapsed onto the bed, and I watched him until his breathing evened out, his face relaxed. I couldn't sleep. I just sat there, staring at the window. The next morning, Steven acted like nothing had happened. He didn't remember a thing. I showed him his hands, expecting the torn nails, the bloody fingertips, but they were fine. Perfectly fine. He laughed it off, said I must have been dreaming, but I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. We packed up, ready to leave. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. Steven was humming to himself as he loaded our bags in the car, completely unfazed. But as he put his hand on the steering wheel, a jolt ran through me. There, just under his wrist, was a small scar, the shape of two interlocking circles with a serpent twisting between them, the same symbol from the grave.
Stefan? Where did you get this?
He had no answer.
It's the same symbol as the grave.
What grave?
The one we saw yesterday.
But he just looked confused. When I insisted, he pulled me by my hand and took me to the place of the grave. But to my shock, when we reached there was nothing. I felt a chill run through me, a deep, gnawing fear that settled in my bones. I did not care to investigate and pulled Steven to the car, driving away. But I am certain that we disturbed an otherworldly presence that day. The snow had been falling heavily all afternoon, turning the rugged trail into a winding sheet of white. My friend John and I had been trekking for hours. We were deep in a forest far off the usual hiking routes, a place which was only known for its grim history. An unfortunate accident during Civil War transpired there. A unit of Confederate infantrymen were stationed there when their gunpowder caches caught fire. Many soldiers were blown up and cried in agony for hours before dying. Rumors were that you could still hear their screams in those lands. As the light faded and the sky darkened, we set up camp near a steep cliff. The wind howled through the branches, sounding almost like voices. We didn't say much as we ate, but there was something in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I brushed it off, just nerves, I told myself. This place feels off, doesn't it? I glanced at him, trying to read his face. His voice was flat, but his eyes had the same weary look I'd been feeling all day. Yeah, I admitted. It's like the air's too heavy or something. Could be the altitude, or maybe we're just tired. We both tried to laugh, but it fell flat. Something wasn't right. As night fell, I found myself staring into the darkness, waiting for... what? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. My body jolted awake like someone had shaken me. The tent was freezing, the fire outside had long since died, and John was still snoring softly beside me. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not faint, distant ones like before, but deliberate, crunching through the snow right outside the tent. I heard a soft scratching sound, not like an animal. No, this was different, like fingers trailing along the side of the tent. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam shaking as I pointed it at the fabric. Nothing. But the scratching continued as soon as I turned it off, low, methodical. I didn't dare move. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the side of the tent, like something or someone had slammed into it. I jumped, my flashlight slipping from my grasp. What the hell was that? John was awake, wide-eyed and pale. Before I could answer, the thudding came again, harder this time. The entire tent shook. I don't know, I whispered, but we need to get out of here. We grabbed our flashlights and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The snow was untouched, pristine, like no one had been there. But the sound, those footsteps, the scratching, it had to be real. I could feel it in my gut. I'm getting creeped out, man. Let's just wait it out. I nodded, even though every instinct screamed to run. A few minutes passed in an uneasy silence. Just as I began to drift off again, I felt the sudden, urgent need to pee. I didn't want to go outside, but there was no way of avoiding it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the biting cold. I walked just a few steps from the tent, finding a spot behind a tree. Just as I was about to relieve myself, I felt a cold, icy hand on the back of my neck. I froze. It gripped me hard, pulling me backward. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the night. but there was no one there. The snow behind me was undisturbed, but I knew something strange was there. That's when the beam of my flashlight fell on the ground ahead of me, where there was a massive crevice, partly hidden by the snow. If I had taken just one more step, I would have plummeted to my death. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back to the tent. I didn't want to wake John. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I just crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to calm myself. The next morning, John was pale as a ghost. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I had the weirdest dream last night. I looked at him, my stomach nodding. I was outside the tent, wearing some old soldier's uniform, and I wasn't me. It felt like I was guarding something, or someone. I stared at him, my mouth dry. Before I could say anything, we both heard it, a distant scream of agony from deep within the trees. We sprang upon our feet and decided to leave the tent behind, preparing to rush away. But just as we emerged out, we saw clear footprints made by heavy boots, emerging from the forest cover and coming towards the face of our tent. We left that place in a hurry. I don't know what it was, but somehow I owe my life to the spirit of some dead Civil War soldier who was probably looking over me.